Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much for joining in this event, online event on labor movements, relationship to Black Lives Matter and faith-based movements, and exploring together the historical lessons for today. We are very pleased to have with us today Assistant Professor Naomi Williams from Rutgers University, who is a historian of US working class activism and social movements, as well as Assistant Professor Sergio Gonzalez at Marquette University, at US, historian of US migration, labor, and religion. Thank you very much, Naomi and Sergio, for joining us and for joining the group of activists that are together with us in this online event. Before I start with the first question, I would really invite everyone to please write in the chat box where you're writing from and which organization. And if possible, please do keep your cameras on. We start straight with the first question for each of you, just to start a bit the conversation. Naomi, while political equality was always central to the civil rights movement, and we saw that in very prominently in one of the video lectures that was in our labor history online course, its leaders never endorsed separating political rights from economic rights. In a recent article, Cheever argued that civil rights were seen as part of larger assembly of social rights, at the heart of which were jobs, housing, healthcare, and education. However, whereas the early agenda of the movement was tied to the interests of the working class Blacks, by the end of the 80s, ideas of racial justice came to reflect the interests of more elite sections. The race politics of this period was detached from commitments to redistribution and economic rights and turned away attention from social structures and group relations. Instead, it focused more on individuals and on removing barriers to upward mobility for women and minorities. We see the emergence of the so-called identity politics, for which the aggressive pursuit of diversity in professional ranks and more militant policing of the cultural sphere as a way of addressing the systematic racism. Then the brutal murder of George Floyd happened, and that gave a special impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Naomi, how is the Black Lives Matter movement connected to the US civil rights movement and the labor movement? What is different, and how does it differ from the identity politics of the earlier generation?
Hello, everybody. And first, I want to say thank you. It's great to be a part of the series of conversations and a part of what the GLU is doing more broadly for working people across the world. So thanks for having me. I'll start with just talking a bit about Black Lives Matter, and I'm gonna move the dates around a little bit, as historians tend to do, right? And say that. Well, first, let me go back to identity politics, right? So identity politics can be used in sort of way to diffuse or misdirect from working class activism more broadly. And people who are at the bottom of the social order, right, can't only focus on one aspect of what's happening in the world, right? Their social structures, they're all different types of oppression that poor and working people are fighting for. And so what happened in the mid-1970s, 1980s in the United States in the national political and cultural agenda was a move away from working class issues and focusing on national politics and national trends and national organizations. You get the impression that people weren't blending economic, social, and political issues all together. But when you zoom in to the local level, and when you look at individual communities and worker activists and community activists and the lives they're leading, you see a much more complicated story. And so if you take your perspective from working people what you see in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and until today are groups and individuals working collectively across a broad spectrum of oppressions, right? Fighting for liberation. And so for Black Lives Matter, I want to move it back to 2012, right? With the murder of Trayvon Martin in Florida, and then the acquittal of his murderer in 2013, and then which is the start of, you know, an online social media Black Lives Matter hashtag and just mobilizations. And then really with Ferguson, with Mike Brown, right? Mike Brown being murdered unarmed, minding his business, right? Just, it was such a shock. And it became a rallying cry for Black Lives Matter, and it moved Black Lives Matter, the movement, from social media to the streets. Right. And so local community activists in Ferguson were able to use a long history of their complaints about police brutality, over surveillance, the stealing of resources from Black and brown neighborhoods, right? And they were able to use all of that to call for demands and for a reckoning, right? Which explodes again in 2020 with help me out, sorry, with
With
George
George Floyd.
Floyd.
George Floyd, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. With the murder of George Floyd, right? And that murder happens during an economic shutdown and the public health shutdown around COVID. And so more people are at home, right? Engaged in media, both social media, news networks, and everything. They see what happens. It's very clear, right? And it's an opportunity to kind of link a lot of small local community activists back together into the movement for Black lives. But the movement for Black lives, the Black Lives Movement, before it became the movement for Black lives, right, really starts with 3 Black feminist radical activists, right? And they definitely connect their work and their activism to the early civil rights movement. So if you think back to, in the United States, to what some historians call the long civil rights movement, then you can go back to the 1930s. I would even argue going back to the abolition of slavery. But let's just start in the 1930s, right? When there's this whole, multiracial, international, immigrant and Native worker effort, right, to recover from the Great Depression, to demand social safety net programs, right? To demand the federal government to get engaged and involved in restoring economic stability. And so if you look at this long movement and the Black radical tradition within the United States, which is also inspired by immigrants coming from African countries, from Caribbean countries, and just refueling generation after generation some of these ideas, you see that the Black civil rights movement has always had a radical component that's often missed in mainstream conversations about the civil rights movement. But you can trace that, right? And you can trace it from Black women who are excluded from most employment and then find security in domestic labor, and the ways that they use that, right, to politicize themselves and their communities, to fight for local laws and regulations that improve their lives, improve the lives and outcomes of their children and their families. And so what Elisa Garza and Patrisse Cullors and the other woman did when they got together and formed this budding organization of Black Lives Matter is they used the history that they already knew. They used their already engaged communities to grow and expand on these ideas. And so the agenda for the Black Lives Matter movement, when you look at their vision plan, right, most of the items on that agenda call for economic justice, right? It's anti-capitalist in nature. It's radical in its politics. And so that long history really is imbued in what we see as Black Lives Matter. And the organizations, right? The reason why the name has changed to the Movement for Black Lives, and what we see after 2017, in 2020 and beyond, is the fact that a lot of organizations that are somewhat aligned, some of them are more aligned than others, and they have disagreeing points, but it's a coalition of folks that say, we understand that the liberation of Black people, the liberation of immigrant workers, means that it's the liberation for all of us. And so they come together around that solid idea. And that's what makes Black Lives Matter really tied to the civil rights movement and also tied to the labor movement in the United States. I'll pause here and kind of let other people jump in, but just wanted to get started with that.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Really, really great. I don't know whether there is an immediate question for Naomi right now. Please raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. I have so many questions, but I don't want to take space. Perhaps we move a bit to the Sergio and the question more specific of that question. And I'm sure, Sergio, perhaps there is lots of overlap and think that you could pick up. I don't know. Gifford, do you want to make the point so I don't have to read it? And if you have a question?
Well, I think this idea, hi, I'm Gifford from San Francisco. I'm a glue trainer. In the killing of Oscar Grant by transit cops in 2009, kicked off the Bay Area, and the Panthers were started in Oakland. So it was kind of a continuous tradition. And it made the Occupy focus more on race and class, I think, than most other. Not perfect, but, we even called it a general strike. It probably it wasn't. I was there. But I think this idea, I want to kind of come back to this idea. We go back to W.D. Du Bois's chapter 5 in Black Reconstruction. He said when the slaves stopped working on the plantations, it was a general strike. And then jumping forward to like 1968, Martin Luther King at the Memphis rally with, I don't know, tens of thousands of people called for a general work stoppage. 17 days later, he was assassinated. So I think, you take risks calling for the unity of class and race. And, people like Martin Luther King paid for it with his life. So I do see the complete necessity of not separating race and class. So I don't know if that's a question, but I think what we're onto here is really important stuff. So I thank you.
Yeah, if I can just jump in for a short response to that. I think you're exactly right. And, in my work, I look at the Occupy and Black Lives Matter movements together with the fight for 15. So the fight for the $15 minimum wage in the United States that really kind of kicks off from Black Lives Matter and Occupy in the United States. It's transformative for so many of that generation because it brings a lot of different ideas together. So the thing that we actually don't talk about very much with both of these movements is that it's also about queer liberation, right? So for the LGBTQ plus community and for immigrant rights, for Indigenous rights, and it helps folks get involved with Indigenous campaigns to stop pipelines. It comes out of the housing market crash that left so many people homeless, right? People in the United States where wealth is built on home ownership. For millions of families to lose that, it's a big blow, right? It's a blow to what people think of as, or people thought of really as the American dream, right? Which has been continually eroded over the last few years. But these movements, Occupy, Black Lives Matter, and the fight for $15 minimum wage really transformed this generation of protesters to think more broadly, right? To take this intersectional approach to liberation, to abolition, and what comes of that. So I'll just stop there and say thank you for bringing that in, because the whole point is, right, there's this long trajectory and it really takes place in communities. And so looking locally matters, even at the national stage, because these local movements push and change so that now, even though our federal minimum wage is $7.20 some cents, right, most local areas have higher minimum wages than that.
Thank you. Thanks, Gifford, for that comment, the question. Sergio, we can turn now to the faith-based movements and perhaps even picking up on the Fight for 15. I mean, I've always been so impressed with Reverend Barber being on the forefront of those movements and articulating this kind of struggles in faith, you know, from a person of faith perspective. And so let's look a bit at that relationship in between the labor and faith-based movements, the relationship based on these ideals of human dignity and social justice, which, you know, are all the more important at these times of authoritarian rising authoritarian right, which is instrumentalizing in the most disgraceful ways faith, whether that's in the US or in Turkey or in India. So, of course, from the perspective of the US, how has the faith and faith-based movement influenced worker mobilization and movements over time? And do we observe the same kind of waves of alignment and disalignment as with the racial justice movement? Although I take Naomi's point very much that you could almost tell two stories, one story of that mainstream story, and perhaps it's kind of a reading of the trajectory of the Democratic Party, the party that when it became a party of elite, it also became a part of the Black elites. So that's kind of perhaps the more mainstream story, but there is another story. And do we see kind of similar trends in that relationship, Sergio?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for having me today. I want to thank Naomi for inviting me to be a part of the JLU universe here and to participate in these wonderful conversations. I think Naomi has set us up well to kind of trouble the predominant narratives that we have. And I think your question leads us to think about the way in which we often frame religion, or at least popular media perceptions of religion as being a conservatizing force, that it is inherently the domain of the right. And what the reality is lived on the ground by working class people who themselves are people of faith or who have different allegiances to different houses of worship or different denominations, and the way in which they understand their faith obligations as part and parcel to the way in which they live their lives as working people, whether at the work site or in their everyday lives. And I think the misconception that we have as a popular narrative in 2025 is one that labor scholars have wrestled with now for over 50 years. And I would say that there are large sections of the labor movement, especially in the United States, that sometimes understand and misunderstand the idea of religion as solely being an issue that is the domain of the religious right. And so, you know, I'm going to reach back here as a labor historian to think back to one of the great scholars in the field of labor history, and that's Herbert Gutman. And all the way back in 1966 was pushing labor scholars as well as practitioners of labor organizing to be more critical about the way in which we think about the relationship between religion and working class communities, right? To remind us that there are many functions of religion that can't be understood merely by analyzing what a clergyman says or what a denominational body says, right? What the instruments of persuasion might be that are coming from the leaders of an organization, that we actually have to get onto the ground, as Naomi is reminding us, and to actually look at the way in which working class people understand questions of faith, right? That there are a variety of different ways that the working class and working class communities understand faith, that we have to dig into the social and economic structures that shape communities, the voluntary associations that working class people create, whether those are the things that we understand like trade unions or like mutual aid societies, but also how they can be lived out within places of faith, right? And to think about how that is transmitted through the shared values that people create. And I personally come to this from a very, I guess, a very deeply felt space, because when I was growing up, I grew up in a household that practiced immigrant and labor rights, and we did so actively every single Sunday. And my mom would take us to church a lot, not because we were a very pious family, but because my mom was an immigrant and labor organizer, and she understood the church, the Catholic Church specifically, as a place to organize. So in the early 2000s, the AFL-CIO here in the United States created a program called Labor the Pulpit, where they tried to make these very explicit connections between labor organizing and religious spaces. And they found those friendly churches, those friendly clergymen, who would open up sanctuaries as places where labor organizers could come in, take the pulpit at the end of service or at the end of Mass, and talk about the dignity of labor, and to remind working class people, of course, that the people that are sitting them in front of them in the pews, that they have all of the language that they need, all of the tools that they need within the teachings of the church, within Scripture, and specifically within the Catholic Church, within 100 years of history of social action teaching, right? That there, in fact, since 1891, the Catholic Church has been very clear that it is the obligation of Catholics and people of faith to abide by the dignity of labor that is deeply embedded within the Old and the New Testament, right? That all these tools are already in there within the religious teachings. And so if the tools are available there, and we think about this more kind of an instrumentalist or a utilitarian way of understanding faith as a potential tool for building working class power and labor power, we have all the things that we need there, right? So I'm going to turn you to think a little bit about one great sociologist, Pierrette Hondigneux Sotelo, who has written about the intersections between faith, labor, and immigrant organizing, to understand that there are kind of these four factors we should keep in mind. And maybe when we kind of jump into our conversations, we can think about these four factors as bridges to kind of supersede those misconceptions we have about there being a division between working class people, radical organizing, progressive organizing, and faith, that these don't have to be separate domains. In fact, they can be intimately connected, right? So the sociologist Pierrette Hondigneux Sotelo reminds us that religion can provide social movement actors with moral justification and motivation for action, that there is a social movement language that already exists within the Scriptures, within the Old Testament, within the New Testament, within the teachings of other faith as well that are not just Christian faiths, right? That there are already kind of these deeply revered texts that remind us that the beloved community, to borrow from the Reverend Martin Luther King, can only be developed when everyone is allowed to flourish, right? That the Catholic Church, in fact, has been one of the strongest critics of capitalism. That doesn't mean that necessarily they've supported communism or socialism, but they have provided the tools for us to provide, to kind of have these criticisms of economic structures that degrade human beings and that push them to the margins of society. All right, so number two, religion provides working class people with resources. And this is something that I deeply study in my research, looking at Latino immigrants in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that the church has money, it has buildings, it has structures, and that those tools can be used by working class people and by social movements for their own ends, which are, of course, to develop more just worlds for all people, and specifically for working class people. In a country like the United States and in other countries around the world, religion, of course, holds a highly valued space, right? It has a certain amount of social capital, and that social capital can be deployed in the service of working class movements. So if I'll turn to a specific example, I study the U.S. sanctuary movement in the United States in the 1980s, a movement to support Central American asylum seekers seeking refuge in the United States. The administration of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s revered itself, kind of promoted itself as a deeply Christian presidency, right? That they really took the domain of the religious right and appropriated it for their political ends. And here you had an insurgent leftist movement coming in from the bottom up that argued if the Reagan administration was such a Christian presidency, was such a Christian administration, why was it denigrating these immigrants and these refugees and sending them off to die in Central America, deporting them, right? So to say, if you are a Christian president, if you believe in these things, why are you not actually practicing the Christian faith and the tenets of the Christian faith? And then finally, religion can offer ritual and shared cultural practices, which, as we know, as social movement organizers and scholars, all of us here on this call, we need to have those rituals and those practices to bring people together, right? To kind of create some sort of cohesive idea of a social movement that can offer us the succor and all of the fellowship that we need in the hardest times when we're developing our social movement. So religion can offer us all the tools that we need to do that work. And we can look throughout American history, and I'm sure talking with other people in this call, other nations' histories where religion and houses of worship have served as these foundational and fundamental spaces for social movement organizing, whether it's the Black Civil Rights Movement, it's immigrant justice organizing today, or other movements as well. We can also, if we want to talk about the the ways in which the narrative of the religious right is also correct, where there have obviously been very deep examples of the co-option of this language for a political end. But I just wanted to start with a counterpoint to think about how we can think about places of worship and faith as potential well springs for the social movement organizing that the people on this call care about, which is to say, organizing for working class justice.
Well, thank you very much. Really, really very important reflections. Much appreciated. The floor is open. Who would like to take the floor or make a question or a comment? And of course, Naomi, if you want to pick up on something that Sergio said, please do so while we wait for Gifford. Did you want to say something? No? No. Okay. No, I just saw the microphone on.
So I will jump in and say thank you, Sergio. That was beautiful, and it reminds me, right? Thinking about something more recently than my research, right? In Chattanooga, Tennessee, and auto workers trying to organize, Volkswagen plants, and they were being met with race baiting, right? And what they did to counteract that was to hold prayer meetings together. And so the workers got together, they held hands, they said prayers, they built solidarity, they built connection, they built community, right? Because they were separated at work. Some were hired directly by the plant, some were hired by employment agencies, and then they had different pay rates and different experiences, right? And so they had to find ways to say, what do we have in common? And it was religion, right? And then going back a little bit to my research, thinking about Wisconsin, right? And these huge industries that were booming in the 1940s and the 1950s, well, they started to get a lot of Catholic workers who were experiencing prejudice at work. And what happened is they brought it to the union. And so the unions, the UAW locals in the city got together, and they got the Lutheran ministers and Catholic priests together and said, let's have some conversations in this space, right? And so how can we be more democratic at work and in our communities? And that relationship was longstanding, right? It wasn't like new, because they knew that they could depend on their faith leaders when they were having huge economic fights and strikes and rallies. They knew they could count on them. So the Sunday sermons would be reprinted in the labor newspaper, because the Sunday sermons were saying economic justice is what we need to be doing. Right? It's a requirement to be a good Christian, right? It's a requirement. And so just reminded me of like those long connections, right? In individual spaces of people building community through faith, right? And we can actually go back even further, and stop me when you have questions, right? But we can go back even further to the 1890s, when you mentioned mutual aid societies. What brought so many people together was their church experience and their opportunity to have things translated for them, to have press read, newspapers read to them, and then they bring it to work. And religion was a way that helped build community, which helped them see each other as having common cause, which meant that they were able to fight for democracy in the workplace. And that workplace democracy really exploded, right? Just a generation later, when they were able to see the gains that they had made from the last 50 years or so of organizing and growing, right? The economic booms and busts. And in the 1930s, 1940s, it comes together so that in the 1940s, they can actually address some of these other issues through faith, through religion, through other avenues of coming together, housing and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, who is a better organizer than a minister? I mean, your job as an evangelizer is to bring people to your cause, right? And so there's actually a lot that we can learn from the way in which ministers, pastors, priests, women religious do that work of spreading the word of their faith, right? And there's in some ways, of course, that we can understand the work that we try to do within our work sites, as labor organizers, as a form of proselytization, as a form of evangelization. We have a message to spread. We have something to share with you. We want to bring you into this cause, which is the cause of justice for all, right? This idea that there should not be class-based divisions solely on these economic factors that divide us. I think about the Reverend Barber, since he was mentioned here, right? This modern iteration of the poor people's movement that he's been leading out of North Carolina for over a decade now. And the Reverend Barber, when he's asked about this division between, liberal and conservative, he very proudly states that he is a conservative theologian. And what he means by that is that he believes in the most basic ideas of Scripture, right? That he is not himself advancing a radical idea or progressive idea of religion. It is, in fact, at the root of what Christianity teaches. And I'm reminded about this idea of what it actually means to be radical. And I draw here from Angela Davis, right? Angela Davis reminds us that radical means to grab at the root. That is the etymological concept of radicalism. So all we are doing is grabbing at the root of what these faith practices teach us to do, which is to, love our neighbor. What does Jesus say, right? For those that you have done for the least of us, you have done to me, right? And this is, of course, what is at the heart of solidarity and labor activism. And so when, Naomi and I had the pleasure of being trained at one of the greatest labor universities in the country, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And when I went to graduate school, for me, it was dumbfounding, right, to begin to engage in labor scholarship and to realize that labor scholars had this blind spot about religion. And I think in some ways, labor organizers sometimes do as well. And I think that's because we sometimes misunderstand the Marxist criticisms of faith and religiosity, which is to say that we should, of course, be skeptical about organized religion and about leaders, but we should be skeptical of all forms of organized institutions and all leaders, right? This is, of course, the work that we have to do as communities. We have to provide that skepticism and have those criticisms in place because, institutions can become calcified. Institutions have a specific directive, which is, of course, to continue the institution itself, not necessarily to provide for the people that make up those institutions. And so the same criticisms that we would apply to organized religion, we should have to all forms of institutions in our lives as well. And so I think the best types of labor organizing, the most effective types of labor organizing are the ones that listen to the people, right? The actual individuals who make up the movements, who are responsible for the movements, who the movements are supposed to be working on as a part of, and to meet them where they are. And so if a working class person tells you that faith is important to them, if the place where they organize, in other words, the place where they get together is church, well, that's where you have to start. And I think we have seen, at least across the 20th century, some of the most effective forms of labor organizing have met people where they are.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, and very, very important reflections, somehow also connecting to some questions we have received because we're also live streaming. I think some of them are perhaps are already discussed by you, but please, if you want to add, do. How can labor movements best work with faith-based movements, which are sometimes accused of seeking converts more than economic and social justice? I think a point that was kind of made, but please feel free to add. And another one, how to apply the lessons learned in Black Lives Matter movement and similar movements to labor organizing initiatives around the world. Another point that you made. But I think also the question you're saying, it's not about instrumentalizing faith, but it's really about if we don't connect to that important dimension of one's life, the right will connect, and it will connect in the most disgraceful way, as we've seen. So this is really about also claiming the emancipatory soul of the faith, and in that way, do you see that to the extent that labor focused more on bread and butter issues and in a very narrow sense, it also got disconnected from all this. It had a bit of a self-righteous way of seeing how the world should look like. But I mean, over to you, whatever.
Yeah, And I want to kick it back to Naomi in a second here to think, because I think this is a good segue to talk about identity politics as kind of this empty vessel as a term that in fact sometimes clouds more than it actually illuminates. And so there's a way in which we can think about focusing specifically only on bread and butter issues, right? Only on what we would call class issues, and ignoring the fullness of what people actually are when they bring themselves to the movements that we hope to create here, right? And so in the same way that we can try to ignore a person's identity and the fullness of it, we can also then ignore their faith in the things that they hold important to themselves. And that just makes us bad organizers, right? Which is only going to be a detriment to the movements that we're trying to create here. And so for me, whenever you foreclose any sort of opportunity to connect with someone, you are doing a disservice to the movement that you're trying to build. That is, of course, not to say that we need to have, of course, a lodestar that we're working toward, which is that emancipatory abolitionist form of understanding of world in which there are no barriers for people to live full lives, right? I mean, this is, of course, I think labor activism when it's practiced at its best, understands solidarity as one of interconnectedness, right? So we still need to have that, but we can't do so in such a confining way, a constricted way that denies the fullness that people bring to the movements that we're trying to create here.
Indeed, definitely, Sergio. And I think, it goes back to a term that some organizers were using in 1940s and 1950s called total person unionism, which today, right, we can talk about, describe as, and bring our analytical engagement with is intersectional organizing, right? So people are whole humans, which is why, the history that I do, the history that Sergio does, right, really looks at the whole person, right? And so the reason why I don't call myself a labor historian, and instead I use the historian of working people, is because people have to be at the center all the time. So for scholars, for activists, for organizers, right? If you're not looking at a person completely, then you're missing opportunities to bring folks into your movements. And that's really what makes Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, so expansive. And such an opportunity to bring folks in, right? And Reverend Barber is really amazing and wonderful, and he learned a lot too from James Lawson, the Reverend James Lawson. And, I love the title of a book about Jim Lawson. It's called Love and Solidarity, right? And it's these ways of bringing folks together, knowing exactly where they are and what they need. And, part of the victory of the mobilizations in the early to mid 20th century was this labor law apparatus, this employment law apparatus that we have in the United States that prioritizes collective bargaining. But workers have always known that collective bargaining is just one tool in a whole box of tools that they have, right? And so the best thing that workers can do to improve economic justice for themselves at work, in their communities, and in larger society is through direct action. And it's direct action and mobilization that forces enforcement of so-called laws, right, that are supposed to be in place. But over time, falling into this collective bargaining rules and regulations and policies, there was a cooling off, right? And so some unions, and especially the national organizations, right, in their effort to fit into this so-called liberal coalition, they stamped down on radical activism. But workers at the bottom understood, like, if collective bargaining wasn't work, we had to sit down at the plant. We had to go out with our picket signs. We had to go to church and pull our communities together and say, okay, how are we going to win this fight? And so even in the attempted policing of those things, it's not effective, because workers always, we know intuitively, right, that we have to join coalitions with other folks and get out there and use direct action to get the things we need. Those are our most powerful tools. And so using that is a way to kind of disrupt this, identity politics and, going by the collective bargaining laws and policies and practices that we have in place. It's bigger than that. And so organizers who understand this, know that they have to understand what's happening in the community. You can look at it when in the 1970s in the United States, for example, the law expanded to include hospitals and public workers in public hospitals, right, to be able to organize under the Fair Labor Standards Act in the United States. So access to minimum wage and overtime requirements. And so unions jumped on board and said, okay, great, we have this new sector of workers that we can organize. And, you know, they had amazing victories in some places, and they tried to just like pick that up and drop it down somewhere else, and it fails miserably. Right? Because organizers didn't take the time to understand that you can't take something that works really well in the northern part of the United States, bring it to the southern part of the United States, and then expect it to operate the same way when there's different political, social, and economic realities on the ground. So knowing what's happening on the ground is really important. And I think that that's where the movement for Black Lives has been much more successful, even though we don't hear about it, right? I think that it's because people are putting on their union cap and putting on their political organizer cap, but they're operating from this standpoint of intersectional organizing to bring folks together. And they're using that because of what they've learned from the Black Lives Matter movement.
And I'll just jump in here and say that, you know, Naomi drops this idea of full personhood. You know, in the 1930s and 1940s, another term that was used, this idea of social unionism, right? And so in my graduate class this semester on labor history, since we're in a university setting here, virtual university setting, I'll drop some footnotes. My students read a great book by Daniel Katz called Altogether Different, which looks at the International Lady Garment Workers Union based out of New York, right, in the 1930s and 1940s. And their development of this robust form of unionism that takes the entire person as they arrive. And they did so out of necessity because, of course, in New York City in the 1920s and 1930s, they're trying to organize in these spaces that are extremely diverse, right? I mean, you have women who are arriving from Russia who are coming from Jewish backgrounds. You have Italian women who are arriving from Catholic backgrounds. You have Puerto Rican women. You have Black women, right? All of these different individuals who bring them full selves to the workspace. But all of them care about one thing, which is to not get screwed over at work, right? And so you have that nut to begin with. But the organizers who organized with the ILGWU in New York City in the 1920s and 1930s recognized from the beginning that in order to stitch together this constituency that needs to be created to make a robust labor movement in New York City, they need to invite, again, these full persons into the labor movement, right? And so they do not ask people to check out the door their religion, their language, their culture, the things they hold dear. They say bring those things into the movement. And in fact, we can begin to not only bridge divides, but to actually stitch together these constituencies into a full movement. And so what happens, like Naomi kind of charts, by the 1940s, the growth of these national, international unions, which are trying to create a what they hope will be a resilient labor movement that will be basically protected through law, begin to kind of shore off these pieces that make people unique and the things that actually invite people into labor organizing spaces, and to the detriment, ultimately, of these movements. It makes them weaker. And so whenever I hear someone make the argument that we need to focus only on the things that bring people together, specifically class, I find that to be such a lazy argument, because what you're refusing to do is the hard work of recognizing people's differences. And ultimately, there is going to be an endpoint to the effectiveness of that organizing, because we have seen that over the last 100 years in the United States. Labor organizing fails whenever union organizers only try to meet people on the question of class, when you do not recognize that people bring their full selves to the organizing. And when I say it's lazy, it's because it is hard work. It is extremely hard work to begin to have those conversations about language, about culture, about religion. Think about today. I mean, if we think about religion, of course, you'd have to engage with questions of homophobia sometimes within religious spaces, right? These are very difficult conversations to have, but we need to have them. We can't just act like they don't exist. And so when we dig into this work and we kind of look at the most successful forms of labor organizing, I think in the 20th century, specifically in the United States, it's the ones that have run full steam ahead into engaging with these questions and to see if they can be worked out in a way that can bring people to the table.
Thank you very much. We have a few comments from Nico on Comrade Nico from Argentina on the chat. Nico, would you like to take the floor? I'm not sure whether eventually you would have a question out of them. Are you there?
I have limitations to it. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we hear
Because
you.
I'm in a public venue. Just what I wrote. The question is very interesting because traditionally the Argentinian labor movement was very much skeptical about religion, but Pope Francis built his power from that. And the interesting maybe novelty here is that one of his strong allies, I can't remember his name now. Well, it will come. He was very critical of bureaucratic unionism, but he was the type of person that took that risk that you were stressing, Sergio, going into the complexity of that, the hard work, because the unions were comfortable in their structures. And he was very, he pushed the line in terms of achieving or addressing issues of race in a country that like Argentina, which has been, this is pretty much the field I work with. The country has been like invisible to racial issues, assuming that we don't have racial issues. So that's precisely the point. And it's interesting because a strong branch of the informal workers got organized because people like this, well, the legacy of Pope Francis was based on that type of strategy, listening to those, immigrants with different cultural backgrounds, but with strong religious thinking and practice. So congratulations, very, very interesting remarks. And well, the thing I mentioned on the chat is that I'm not sure how Pope Francis is perceived worldwide, but his experience, he became a relevant person because of this, because he was listening to the working class, like deeply from his heart. And that's precisely why he was also very controversial. But thank you once again, both Naomi and Sergio. And I'm sorry, I'm muted. I have very strong limitations where I am at the moment.
Thank you, Nico. That's a phenomenal comment, and I just want to pick up on that. I think you're exactly right that Pope Francis, of course, is a very recent example here, and I would imagine that Pope Leo XIV, the newly installed Bishop of Rome, will have very similar things to say. There's a very specific reason he took on the name of Leo, which is, of course, as a reminder of Leo XIII. The last pope to hold that name, who in 1891 issued one of the most important encyclicals on the relationship between Catholicism, social action, and the dignity of labor, right? I mean, this is something that the previous pope and our current pope understand very well, which is to say that first of all, the majority of Catholics around the world are working class people. And so if we are to listen to the needs of the flock, we need to listen to the needs of the flock at the workspace. And Pope Francis, as you noted, Nico, kind of from his work in Argentina, understood that Argentinians, the majority of Catholics, these were their primary concerns. Now, Pope Francis was a fascinating figure because he himself was also a critic of liberation theology. He never considered himself a liberation theologian, although there are, of course, intersections between Catholicism and this vein of post-Vatican II understanding of Catholic faith and social action that develops out of Latin America. And Pope Francis was critical of liberation theology in some ways, but he understood at the heart what was most important, which is to say that faith, when it's practiced well, needs to be practiced in all aspects of life. And Catholicism, when it's practiced well, understands that those who have been pushed to the margins of society are those who require the most need, and they need to be brought into the center of the conversation. And I think, we will see over the next few years whether Pope Leo continues that ministry. I think he will, just by assuming this name specifically in his first few comments that he's made in his position, lead us to believe that perhaps he will continue that tradition of very, very tightly wedding Catholic social action with the pressing needs of people all around the world today.
Naomi, would you like to say something or?
Yes. I want to jump in here and say that this is part of the reason. So part of what I do at Rutgers here is I work with LEARN, which is our labor education and research network. Rutgers is a public university, and we have a responsibility to the people of New Jersey and and working people all over the world, right? To create what state legislature called in 1947, right, a level playing field in these employment relations. But part of what I do is I train workers, I train management on how to bargain collaboratively, and part of what I do for worker activists is really look at the best ways to organize and bring folks together. And so when people bring up things like identity politics and, oh, we have all of these things that divide us, to Sergio's point, right? It's hard work, but it's essential work, because you're not going to motivate someone to come along with you if you're not meeting them where they are and with their needs and what's moving them, right? So it's really about, okay, what do the workers in this group, right, who've come together to make their lives better, what are they saying their needs are? Workers know. Right? We don't have to tell them this, you could use a pay raise, you could use more democracy in the workplace, right? They know exactly what they need. And so it's really important to ask what do you need, and then support them that way. And so to bring in this question from the chat about Vietnam and religion being outside of the labor movement there, right? It's so individually, what are workers saying? Collectively, what are workers saying? And gathering that data, talking to workers and saying where are their what are their most important spaces of identity, and where do they think they can come together? And then once you know that answer, then you have the answer to the question, right? So if religion is motivating a lot of these working people and it's not included in the labor movement, then that's something that labor organizers need to do, is to bring that in, right? And so there's a great story about the Worker Center in New Orleans, Louisiana, and after Hurricane Katrina disrupted the population there, a lot of new immigrants came in. And so the Worker Center was like, okay, construction work is really dangerous. There's lots of rebuilding, right? That's happening here. And so the organizers wanted to focus on workplace safety. But the workers themselves were like, yeah, that's important, but like right now we need to learn English. And our most important goal is English. And so when the Worker Center said, okay, fine, and they just opened a bunch of English language classes, then all the workers came. And then once they got stronger in their English skills, they were able to move into health and safety at work, and protecting each other at work, and then organizing. And some of them joined formal unions, some of them stayed in immigrant worker centers spaces, which gives them a more flexibility, right? And so not being forced to follow laws and rules that don't apply to their workplaces. So really the important part of all of this really is, what do the workers in the community need, and how can we respond and support them? And I think that when you start from that framework, and your history, your community, the political, economic, and social landscape that they're operating in, then you can be of most use to working people in that area.
And I want to jump off this point here about, there being areas, whether that's, national areas or very much localized areas, where clergy or ministers or the institutional church does not play a role. I mean, I think that is in fact, oftentimes, I think that's actually kind of more the predominant story. And it's because they need to be pushed into the work. Like all institutions need to be reminded who their obligation is to, which is the people who make up the institution. So, I study here in Wisconsin, Latino communities, and I write about these migrant farm workers that arrived in Wisconsin in the 1950s. And initially, when clergy, whether they were Catholic or Protestant migrant ministers, would go into the fields, all they seemed to care about was evangelization. All they wanted to talk about was Jesus, but they didn't want to talk about what Jesus was actually teaching, right? And so I have these oral histories that I've done with migrant farm workers who were here in Wisconsin in the 1950s, and they say, yeah, I mean, they were great. They would bring like hygiene packets, and they would show us a Charlie Chaplin movie, and they would preach. But they would leave and nothing was changed, right? I mean, the work still sucked and the pay was low. And so the question became, what are they actually offering me? So it was the migrant farm workers themselves that had to go to the priest and say, listen, my grandmother goes to church every single Sunday, and she drops a penny or whatever penny she has saved into the collection, right? I mean, she gives you money. What are you giving us back, right? How are you serving us as a community? And it will take the impetus of the workers themselves, the congregants themselves to push, and then it will perhaps take the impetus of individual clergymen who recognize that they have an obligation to do this work. So some of the most dynamic labor organizing that I've seen in Wisconsin here within these migrant and immigrant communities are happening within religious spaces. You have these migrant farm workers who were basically, they were stranded out in rural areas in Wisconsin. There was nowhere for them to organize because their living spaces were their working spaces. They depended on their employers, not just for their jobs, but also for the housing, right? So they really couldn't organize. The only place they felt safe to organize was at the church, because their employers did not see the church as a threatening space. So these migrants on Sundays would go to church, and there were these priests who became radicalized by the Second Vatican Council, and they realized they had to do something. They opened up the church as a place to organize, and they actually opened up the baseball sandlots behind the church as places to organize. So after Mass, right after service, everybody would go out into the field and play baseball. And that's where the labor organizers began to hand out pamphlets. They began to talk, right? Because the employers were not keeping an eye on these spaces. So again, this is just good labor organizing. It's identifying the spaces where you need to organize and then doing the work, finding partners in the community who can be those resources, and then building out the resources that you need to build these movements.
Thank you. Peter, I don't know how long your hand has been up. Somehow it didn't show on my end, but please.
Yeah, I very much want to thank the two presenters. It's an extremely important and interesting conversation. I just wanted to say a couple of things. They're not really questions. In the context specifically, of course, on labor history. First, these debates are not new by any means, and they didn't start in the 1980s or in the last decade. There was an African-American minister who was active in the U.S. Socialist Party, George Woodbey, in the early 20th century. He was one of two Black delegates at, I believe it was the second national meeting of the party, where there was a debate on immigration, where the socialist movement was very much divided between nativists and those who said, we don't understand, these are our working class sisters and brothers, and we have to organize them. And Woodbey, in the context of this debate, said something which I find really great. He said, there are no foreigners, nor can there be. And, that's something that's very much worth recalling today. And it comes from the Black tradition, specifically the socialist labor African-American tradition. And that's very important, I think. And he was not alone, although he was one of the more articulate ones. So just to say the debate is not new. Religion, the role that religion or organized churches play is very much contextual, as is looking at all social movements. So, to go back to what Adlira said at the beginning about a retreat from class on the part of the civil rights movement. There's a general retreat from class in the United States beginning in the 1970s for all kinds of reasons, which we don't have time to go into here. But there's a rollback of the influence of the labor movement. And to the extent that there's this, close relationship between labor and the civil rights movement, that's one of the ways that it plays out. So context is everything. The Catholic Church, liberation theology was enormously important in, the revival of social radicalism generally in Brazil and more widely in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. And it's a couple of things. Francis had a complicated relationship with liberation theology. The Polish Pope, John Paul II, was named Pope, became Pope, with the specific purpose of wiping out liberation theology. And yet, Polish workers see him as a symbol of liberation. And I think it's equally important in looking at that Pope. The one encyclical, I believe, that was issued under his papacy concerning work and society is an extremely radical document. and its radicalism and its perception, the depth of its perception, far exceed anything that was being produced by labor movements or social democratic parties in that period. So again, what can I say? Life is complicated, but context is everything. And if you look once again at liberation theology in Latin America, it's been undercut in recent decades by the rise of evangelism, whose base is in the favelas and amongst workers, whose mass base is in the favelas and amongst workers, and which propounds a religious doctrine based on individualism and self-enrichment, which is consciously at odds with doctrines of liberation theology, and of course secular doctrines of liberation. So it's important to understand why this shift took place, and not simply to condemn it. So there again, context is everything. Yeah, that's that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. And Sergio and Naomi, perhaps you want to respond and pick up on some of the things, but since we are towards the end, I want to bring in a final question, which is something you have been reiterating, really focusing on this people-centered, worker-centered history. Why is that important? If you could speak to that also, since we are also wrapping up the tutored phase of this course. And that's what we've tried to do with this course, to really go to the stories and tell our own stories. And why are they important also as a source of inspiration and imagination of what is actually possible to do? Because earlier generations have also lived through their dark times, and that we might actually learn from that sort of focus on worker struggles and workers' stories of resistance for our times.
It's the best way to understand history, right? And if we don't know our history, then we don't have the power, right? And so even if we're thinking about, just for me, right? And I have a super close connection with my maternal grandfather, and just knowing that, like, he grew up as a sharecropper, and he only was able to go to the 3rd grade, but he became such a leader in the community. And when I was a child, watching people come to his house to ask his advice about buying a car, buying a house, or understanding some complex idea that they needed help with, they came to him. And so for me, like, my family history is a sense of connection to who I am, why the work that I do matters to particular communities. It's helpful. Like, so when workers know their history and they know the role that they and their families and people like them have played, then they feel more connected and they feel more engaged, and they understand that what they do matters. Right? They see it at work, they see it at home, they see it at church, they see it in local politics, where their kids go to school, if their kids can get to school, right? All of these things are become really more powerful when they're based in our history and our struggles. And if it wasn't for working people, we wouldn't have the democracy that we're trying to hold on to today. It's workers who have always said, let more people in. We need to move this. The beautiful thing for me about Wisconsin history is the ways that generation after generation, they're like, oh, hey, come, you belong to us. You're in our community. Come on in. And it really plays out. You see it in the 1980s. You see it in the 1990s. You see it today, where workers say, come, you need to join forces with us. Together, we can make this better. And that's why you have to lead with people always.
Yeah, I'll just jump off with Naomi, and I will reiterate this idea that there is no better tool as an educator and as a historian than to dig into the lives of individuals. And in my classroom, when I'm trying to get a student, especially one who doesn't seem to care about history or the humanities, to be engaged in this, there is no better window for them to enter through than to understand it through the lives of individual people, because it really does humanize these experiences. And to think about here, I think Peter's comments are really important about the tensions that can exist in any of these spaces, whether it's labor organizing spaces, whether it's churches, whether it's social movement spaces, right? The kind of pull towards individualism, the pull to reactionaryism, the pull to all of these different things that ultimately divide us, that make us less human. I think about, the Roman playwright Terence, who said, "I am human, therefore nothing that is human is foreign to me," right? I mean, this is ultimately what we're trying to do, is to get our students to understand that. And when we organize within our workplaces, within our churches, we are trying to develop those constitutive bonds that allow us to do the work of human flourishing, of building, to come back to this idea of the Reverend King, building that beloved community, right? Where all of us can see ourselves as full human beings, and where these artificial boundaries that we create ultimately keep us in statuses of subjugation, whether it's those who are subjugated or those who are doing the subjugating and are then themselves doing harm, right? Moral and human harm to themselves as well by being the oppressor. And so for me, to really to begin that conversation has to start with the story of the individual as part of a larger collective.
Well, thank you very much. Really, really interesting conversation. Perhaps it's the best way of actually closing our events for the Labor History online course. It was really great to spend this hour with you, Naomi and Sergio. Really, thanks very much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And please do complete the online course. We are going to meet in other events, even if we are wrapping up the tutored phase, because we believe that we could really find inspiration in the times we are living, from looking at the labor history and looking at that history even in a critical way and reflecting, because history could have also gone in another way, and exploring those potential trajectories, I think, are important for our imagination today. So thanks again, everyone, and take care and see you around. Thanks a lot. Bye.